This isn't Audible. Pagan Ireland by Eleanor Hull. Copyright 1923. Just expired. I'm gonna read it. Part 1. Social Life in Pagan Ireland. Chapter 1. Early Legends of the Race. Authorities, Keating's History of Ireland, and a bunch of others. Celt and Gael. Without going too deeply into the question of the origin of the Gaelic race, which question has been a puzzle to many learned men, and is not yet fully cleared up, we may at the outset of our inquiries ask ourselves what is meant by the words Celt and Gael. We hear a great deal in Roman times about the Celts who lived on the continent of Europe. Caesar and other Roman writers who observed the habits and manners of the nations among whom their wars brought them tell us about the Celtae and the Celts of Gaul or Gallia, a region including both the France and Switzerland of the present day, and much territory besides. They were sometimes also called Galli, which is believed to mean brave men, and from this their country was called Gaul. From time to time, parts of this Celtic race crossed over the channel which divided them from Britain, and made settlements in the country we now call England. Of the races at that time inhabiting Britain, we know little with certainty, but probably the Picts, who were inhabitants of northern Scotland, and of whom there were settlements also on the northeast coast of Ireland, where they were called Cruithne, were a part of the original inhabitants. On this point there is, however, much uncertainty. Of the foreigners who came to Britain, two great divisions may be traced, who are called respectively the Gaels and the Britons. Of these two, the first comers were the Gaels. They are at this day found in parts of Ireland, in the northern and western Highlands, and in the Isle of Man. But there is proof that in early times they also inhabited parts of Wales and Cornwall, for the language of the earliest stone inscriptions found in these countries corresponds far more closely to the Gaelic than to present-day Welsh or Cornish. Looking at the position of these districts on the northern and western coasts of these islands, it is natural to suppose that the Gaelic race, originally, perhaps, occupying large portions of Britain, were driven west and north by the arrival on the south and east of other tribes. At all events, we find that they were followed by another division of the Celtic race, whose language had similarities to their own, and who seem to have been dispossessed from some center and south area of East England. They settled there in their stead. These were the Brythons, the inhabitants of Britain in Roman times, and the present inhabitants of Wales and Cornwall. They in their turn were dispossessed over a large part of the country by the invasions of the Angles and Saxons, who gradually drove them west and shut up behind the safe borderlands of the Welsh and Cumbrian mountains. Some of them passed over to Armorica, in which they gave their own name, Brittany, where a form of their own language called Breton, which is closely allied to Welsh, is spoken to the present day. One of the most interesting facts which the early literature and history bring out is the close friendship that appears to have been kept up in very early times between the Gaels of Devon and Cornwall and the Gaels of Ireland, or, as they styled themselves, the Gadils of the east of the sea and the Gadils of the west, and much intercourse was held between them. We may then look at the Britons, or Welsh, and Cornishmen, the Gaels of Ireland and Scotland and of the Isle of Man, and the continental Gauls, as first cousins, and many of the customs noticed by the Roman writers in Gaul are like those of ancient Ireland, and help at times to explain them. Only we must beware of thinking that if a thing is mentioned by a Roman writer as being the custom in Gaul or Britain, it was therefore of necessity just the same in Ireland. Forgetfulness of this has made the study of Irish antiquity often confusion worse confounded, and has introduced ideas that are quite erroneous when applied to Ireland about such matters, for example, as to the early beliefs or the position and occupation of the Druids. The Gaels of Ireland probably retained some older customs and older forms of belief which had become changed in Gaul before and during the Roman occupation. Both in their customs and ideas they seem to have been different. Moreover, the Romans who conquered Gaul and Britain never conquered or effected settlements in Ireland. Hence, they did not impose on Ireland their system of life and ways of thought as they did elsewhere. We have therefore in Ireland an absolutely virgin soil so far as beliefs and customs are concerned, and it is well to study it without any preconceived ideas derived from what we know of other nations. It is the differences in a race, and not the likenesses, that are of the greatest interest to us. Those things wherein the Gael thought his own thoughts, and constructed his own world. Those things in which he differed from the rest of humanity. It is because his ideas come down to us less overlaid than those of other lands by the ideas of other nations, that they are especially interesting and instructive to study. Legends. Though this is almost all we really know about the coming of the Gaels to Ireland, we shall see later on that the old Irish historians, who were very much interested in the early history of their race, invented a number of legends about the various settlements which they supposed were made in ancient times in Ireland. They thought that there were a number of successive conquests made by people of different races who dispossessed each other. It is quite possible that there is some foundation of fact in these stories, for it is most likely that the inhabitants did not all come at once, but in separate detachments. But how much is fact and how much fiction we shall never know, and the legends are now chiefly interesting because they show us how our forefathers thought about these things, and that ideas that they had concerning their own past and history. The Greeks, the Romans, the Jews, and many other nations preserve old stories telling how their ancestors came to settle in the lands which they afterwards possessed. Let us consider some of these early legends of the Irish race. The Irish writers of medieval times were anxious to make out that Ireland was inhabited at a very early period indeed. They liked to think that their race was as old as the Jewish nation, about whom they read in the Bible. So after they became Christians, they made up a story to prove that even before the flood, the first inhabitants had arrived in Ireland. You will easily see that they could have invented this story after they had learned Christianity, for if they had been heathens, they would not have read the Old Testament or known about the flood. It was said in this story that Noah had a granddaughter, whose name was Sisera, who, however, is not mentioned by Moses. She and her father sent a message to Noah, asking him to keep an apartment for them in the ark, but Noah replied that he had not room for them, and he advised them to go into the western part of the world where no one yet lived, and therefore where sin had not been committed, as perhaps the flood, which was sent as a punishment for sin, might not overtake them there. Some accounts say that Sisera was so angry that she said that she and her people would forsake Noah's God and take an idol with them to worship. Finally, she with her father, brother, and husband set out, with 50 maidens along with them, and came to Ireland. But alas, the flood followed them even there, and they were all drowned. This curious old story was firmly believed for many centuries, and we find some of the old historians putting it into their histories, which shows us how careful we have to be in accepting the legends from the old chronicles. Many otherwise sensible people have been confused by these stories, so they seem to be unable to judge what part of them is fact and what part legend. And they think that it is for the honor of Ireland that they should accept all they find in the old books as sober truth. But the old historians had not the means of distinguishing fact from fiction as we have today. Moreover, as I said, they were so anxious to make Irish history correspond with the history they found in the Old Testament that they were obliged to put in many things to lengthen out the period during which men were supposed to have lived in Ireland, in order that the dates might agree with those that are generally given in the Bible. But the later historians, such as Keating, did not believe all these old stories. Dr. Geoffrey Keating was, in his day, a learned and wise man, and he tells us that he only put down the legends as he found them, but he did not think that they could all be true. It is just in the same way that we propose to tell these legends here. They are interesting because they show us what our forefathers thought about their history, but they are not all to be accepted as facts. After a time, there was another legend added, story of Sisera. For the storytellers began to think that if Sisera and all her companions had been drowned, it was hard to see how the knowledge of their coming had been preserved. So it was added that Fintan, the husband of Sisera, somehow escaped the flood and lived for many years afterwards, so that he was able to relate not only his own history, but that of all the races who afterwards took possession of Ireland. We find him called upon in the 6th century by the king, Dermot MacCarville, to give his opinion as to the original extent of the province of Meath, because he was the oldest and wisest man in the kingdom. He was then an elderly man of some 5,000 years. The 5 settlements. We will now relate the coming of the other tribes whose arrival Fintan is supposed to have witnessed, and who are said to have settled in Ireland at different periods, one after another. But you will remember that the story of these early races is not to be taken as a certain history, though there is very likely a foundation of truth in it. The old stories of Ireland tell us that there were 5 distinct invasions of the country. Of the first 2, the invasion of Partholon and the invasion of Niamh, we know very little. Partholon is said to have had to fly from his own country because he had murdered his father and mother in endeavoring to obtain the kingdom from his brother. He and his followers lived chiefly in the pleasant country between Tulloch and Howth, near Dublin, a district which was called Magnalta, the plain of the bird flocks, on account of the flocks of beautiful birds which used to congregate there. Partholon was a man of passionate temper, and he only lived 30 years after his landing in Ireland. His people were all swept away by a terrible plague, which the old writers thought was sent by God as a punishment for the crimes of their leader. It is curious that the name Tulloch, or Tomlucht, where they are said to have been buried, means a plague grave, and on the slope of the hill are still to be seen rude graves or burial mounds in which cinerary urns have been found. Second invasion. The second invader, Niamh, is said to have come from Scythia. His people were terribly harassed by fleets of pirates called Fomorians, or sea robbers, who descended upon the north coast and endeavored to subdue the new settlers. These troublesome marauders are said to have come from Africa, but it is more likely that they came from the north of Europe. Even afterwards in Irish history, a cruel giant was called a Fomorian. So terrible were their descendants, and so frightened were the settlers of them. The Nevidians conquered them in 3 battles, but in spite of this, they returned and avenged their defeats by enslaving the race of Nemid. They imposed on them a heavy tribute. Every year at Samhain, or Samhain, or Halloween, the unfortunate people had to give them 2/3 of their children, and of their corn, and of their milk kine, besides flour and cream and butter in abundance. This tax was collected by a female steward, named Liach, and at the last, this tax aroused so much indignation that the oppressed people gathered together and besieged the Fomorians in Tory Island off the coast of Donegal, where they had built a fortress and where they kept their fleet. They destroyed the tower, but as fresh companies of robbers continued to arrive on the coast, the children of Nemid finally decided to leave the country, and after long preparations they all scattered in different directions and settled in other lands, leaving only a small remnant behind. The Firbolg. It is from one of these escaped chiefs of the second colony that the third body of settlers are supposed to have been descended. Simeon de Brock, son of Starn, went to Greece, and his descendants became so numerous that they were enslaved by the Greeks out of terror of their increasing power. They were called Firbolg, or men of the bags, or leather wallets. This name was given to them because the Greeks compelled them to carry bags of rich soil from the valleys up to the stony heights in order to turn them into gardens. At last they could endure their slavery no longer, and it is said that they either made boats of the leather bags in which they had toiled, or stole some Greek ships and escaped. They turned toward the distant island from which their ancestor had come, and 217 years later, after he left Ireland, they set foot on its shores. Their 5 leaders partitioned the kingdom into 5 provinces. The Firbolg did not bear a very good character in Ireland, for people who have been long enslaved often become degraded. Only one writer says that everyone who was a tattler, guileful, and tale-bearing, noisy, contemptible, every mean, wretched, unsteady, harsh, and inhospitable person, was sure to be a Firbolg. But we must remember that this was the opinion of their enemies, who conquered and oppressed them, and there are proofs that this opinion was not a true one. Ferdia, the friend who was also the opponent of Cuchulainn, and was almost as great a warrior and quite as brave and noble as a man as he, was a Firbolg, and in the great war of Tyne Bo Cuiling, or Cattle Raid of Cooley, this race was specially noted for its quickness and cleverness. They were then known as the 3 tribes of the Fir Domnan, Fir Gallion, and Firbolg, and they formed part of the army of Leinster. This is specially noted that they had pitched their tents and lighted their fires before the rest of the troops had even reached the camping ground. Tuatha de Danann. The dominion of the Firbolg was not long in Ireland, for when 36 years were ended, a fresh enemy appeared to dispute the kingdom with them. This was the mysterious race called the Tuatha de Danann, who were supposed to possess all sorts of magical power and were afterwards looked upon as great gods, the deities of the pagan Irish. The people who came after them believed that they could invoke magic mists to bewilder the enemy, that they could raise the dead to life and do all sorts of miraculous things. What really seems to have been true is that they were more learned and clever in all sorts of arts and in knowledge of natural things than the races with whom they mingled, so that these more ignorant people thought that they possessed supernatural powers. They brought with them to Ireland the knowledge of medicine, of building, of making cups and weapons of brass and other metals, besides the skill in harp playing for which the Irish afterwards became so famous. There is a story told of one of their leaders, Lugh the Long-Handed, who afterwards became the god of the light or of the sun, which shows how accomplished some of these people were. It is said that he came one day to the door of Tara, the palace of the king, and asked admittance. The doorkeeper replied, "What art dost thou practice? For no one in who is not master of an art or trade can enter Tara." He said, "Question me then, I am a right." "We need thee not," said the doorkeeper, "we have a right already." He said again, "Question me, I am a smith." "We need thee not," said the doorkeeper, "we have a smith, who is perfect in 3 new processes." "I'm also a champion in battle," said the visitor. "We need thee not," said the porter. "We have already a most famous warrior, a master in all the arts of war." And so the conversation went on, Lugh protesting that he was a skilled harper, a hero, a poet, a historian, a magician, a doctor, a worker in brass, and a cupbearer. When he was refused to all these counts, he bade the porter go and demand of the king whether he had in his service anyone who was equal master of all these arts at once. If so, he would not ask to enter Tara. The king said that he should be put to one test, namely, whether in addition to all else, he was a good chess player. The chessboards were brought out, and Lugh won all the stakes, after which he could no longer be refused. This story is interesting as it shows us not only what arts the early races practiced, but how much importance was attached to the knowledge of a trade. No idler, it appears, was permitted to enter the king's palace. These wise and clever people seem to have come from Greece, and they landed on the northwest coast of Ireland in a thick mist, which lasted for 3 days, and which they are said to have raised to hide their advance from the Firbolg. They marched unseen to Slabni Iran, or the Iron Mountain, in County Leitrim. They then sent an embassy to the chiefs of the Firbolg at Tara, demanding the kingdom or challenging them to battle. The Firbolg chose to fight for their rights, and the two armies marched to a place called Southern Moytura, or Moytura Cong, in the County Mayo, near Cong, and on the shore of Logue Mosque. Sorry about completely destroying these names. Here a furious battle was fought during 4 days, in which the Firbolg were utterly beaten, and an immense number were slain. Even at the present day, the district over which this great battle is said to have been fought is covered with memorials of it. It extends over about 5 or 6 miles of countryside opposite the village of Cong, and on this piece of ground there are 5 groups of stone circles, 3 of which are over 54 feet in diameter, besides 6 or 7 large cairns of stone. One of these cairns has always been known as the Cairn of the One Man. It was opened some years ago, and in it was found a single urn, in which the bones of a man had been interred. The urn is now in the Royal Irish Academy collection at Kildare Street, Dublin. There is an incident in the old tale of the battle which exactly explains this. On the morning of the 2nd day of the battle, the king of Firbolg, King Ecked, or Iki, retired to the only well in the neighborhood to refresh himself with a bath. The place is well known, opening in the rock beneath which the river channel runs from the Logue Mask to Logue Corrib, the river here flowing nearly all the way underground. While he was bathing, 3 of the enemy passed by, saw the king, and demanded his surrender. They were still talking when a brave body servant of the king came up behind, attacked the 3 men, and killed them all. He was, however, so covered with wounds that he died immediately after. The king had him interred with great honor in the cairn, which has been ever since called the Cairn of the One Man. From agreements such as this, we may learn that the old tales are not all invention, whilst they frequently help to explain the monuments which we find scattered about the country. King Ecked was killed on the last day of the fight. It was midsummer day, hot and dusty, and after the defeat of his army, the king, with a guard of 100 faithful men, left the battlefield to go in search of water to allay their burning thirst. They reached the shore near Ballysadare in Sligo, and here made at last stand against a large body of the enemy, who had followed them. The king was killed after a fierce conflict, in which the 3 leaders of the enemy also fell. The king of Tuatha De Danann lost his hand in this battle, and 7 years afterwards his people made for him a silver hand, so that he had known as Nuada of the Silver Hand. After the battle, the Firbolg who escaped fled to the western isles of Arran, Rathlin, and the Hebrides, and here they all said to have built immense forts on the borders of the ocean in which they defend themselves. Some of the forts ascribed to them remain to the present day, and are the most remarkable and stupendous relics we have of the pagan times. Afterwards, some of them returned to Ireland, and the King of Leinster gave them lands. Others settled in Connacht. They remained quite distinct from the other inhabitants, and were remarkable from their activity and bravery. It is certain that there are still on the west coast of Ireland, mixed with the ordinary population, a small black-haired people, which corresponds exactly with the description given of the Firbolg by the old writers.